Professor M.T. Ladan analyzes soaring African debt crisis, its stranglehold on living costs and sovereignty, and path to recovery. As Africa grapples with a deepening debt catastrophe, sovereign commercial borrowing is projected to reach a record of $155 billion in 2026, a sharp rise from $140 billion on the previous year. According to Professor M.T. Laden, this mounting fiscal pressure is systematically eroding economic sovereignty across the continent, stripping nations of policy autonomy while forcing draconian austerity measures that directly suppress living standards through runaway inflation, currency freefall, and creeping cuts to public services. As Africa grapples with this unfolding crisis, Professor Ladan's latest analysis places a sharp focus on the continent's top 10 economies as of early 2026, from South Africa grappling with logistic bottlenecks to Egypt laboring under the highest IMF debt obligation at roughly $7.55 billion and a staggering 70% interest to revenue nation. He highlights Nigeria's foreign exchange scarcity and mounting debt services burdens, Kenya's heavy eurobond reliance, and Ghana's ongoing restructuring, underscoring that nations like Ethiopia remain at high risk of debt distress while oil-dependent Angola contend with volatile commodity market. The professor explained why debt has become the primary threat to economic sovereignty this year. He points a vicious cycle where countries borrow merely to service existing obligations rather than investing in growth. A dynamic that hands control to creditors over domestic policy making under unsustainable debt load. Nations such as Ghana and Egypt are forced into strict IMF mandated austerity, slashing subsidies and public sector wages. Professor Ladan further warns of a sovereign bank nexus risk, noting that banks across this region are heavily exposed to local debt, linking the entire financial system's stability to government solvency. With more than half of sub-Saharan Africa's population residing in countries that now spend more on interest payment than on health and education combined, he stressed that policy autonomy has effectively been ceded to external lenders. Turning to the cost of living spiral, Professor Ladan traces its root to currency depreciation driven by dollar-denominated debt. As African currencies weaken under surging external obligations, imported goods become prohibitively expensive. Compounding this pressure, he notes, Middle East instability has pushed oil prices past $100 per barrel in the early 2026, sending fuel import costs soaring for nations like Nigeria, Egypt, and Ethiopia. Meanwhile, to meet creditors' conditions, governments are cutting fuel and food subsidies, a move that directly inflates household expenses. High domestic borrowing, he adds, crowd out private sector credit, stifling job creations and further choking economic growth. Among key observations as of April 1st, 2026, Professor Ladan identifies a pronounced shift toward domestic borrowing as foreign capital tightens, placing immense strain on local banks and driving up interest rates from businesses. With African external debt repayment expected to hit $90 billion this year, he described $90 billion wall of refinancing pressure confronting governments. Compounding these words, he notes that high borrowing costs are not matched by adequate tax revenue across many nations, leaving them locked in high-risk status through the remainder of the decade. To navigate this crisis, Professor Ladan advocates a strategic pivot towards regional condition and structural reform. He urged leveraging the African Union to negotiate collectively with creditors and to develop homegrown credit rating frameworks that counteract biased external assessment. Reforming the G20 Common Framework to ensure timely restoration and equitable participation from private bilateral creditors is, in his view, essential. Domestically, he called for robust revenue mobilization, targeting tax collection of at least 15% of GDP coupled with transparent debt reporting to restore investors' confidence. Gradually shifting toward local currency debt, he argues, will mitigate exchange rate vulnerability, provided deeper local financial markets are cultivated. Ultimately, Professor Ladan emphasizes that lasting solutions require structural economic transformation, moving beyond raw commodity export towards domestic processing and value addition to generate sustainable foreign exchange.